Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and I want to welcome you to today's Government Affairs Forum. Here at the Chamber, we're very fortunate to have several prominent change makers from our community speak to our membership, and today our guest is no different. We're joined by City of Boston Mayor Kim Janey as our featured speaker. Earlier this year, Kim Janey was sworn in as the first woman and first Black mayor in city's history. And Mayor Janey, if we were able to have this event live, you would see in front of you several hundred members of the business community giving you a standing ovation. So despite the fact that we're virtual, I hope that you can feel that expression of love. Mayor Janey and her team have since have been hard at work at bringing Boston's region back from a challenging year. And as is the custom of the Chamber, I want to take a moment to recognize the members of the Mayor's Cabinet and all city employees, especially those in the category of essential workers who showed up every day over the past 15 months and enabled the rest of us to live our lives as best we can. So a shout out to all of the city's employees. But I do want to single out Marty Martinez, Chief of Health and Human Services, and his team for the tremendous job they did over the past year, providing guidance and resources and access to tests and vaccinations. Job well done to Marty Martinez. And I hope, as I said before, that all of you can feel the second standing ovation in this virtual platform that we're on today in recognition of all of the work that you've done. Today is Mayor Janey's first major address to the Boston business community. We will hear more about her current priorities, future goals of the recovery, reopening, and renewal of our city. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the Chamber's YouTube page shortly after the presentation. Be sure there will be a Q&A session. Be sure to submit your questions using the Q&A feature on your screen. And engage with other attendees via the chat feature as well. Lastly, before we get started, I'd like to begin with a huge thank you to today's sponsor, Bank of America, our longstanding partner in this government affairs series, Mihal Chamberlain, President, Bank of America, Massachusetts, and Brian Grip, Public Policy Executive at Bank of America, and the entire team that helped the Chamber and the business community bring relevant content to our community, and we appreciate the continued support of Bank of America. And thank you to our friends at Comcast as well, who help bring our government affairs programming to a wider audience, including making today's event available via on-demand after the event. So let's get started with today's event. Mayor Janey will be first speaking to us today via video, and after her speech, we'll be joined live with the mayor for our Q&A. With that, I'd like to welcome Mihal Chamberlain to the virtual stage to introduce Mayor Janey.
Thank you, Jim, for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone. We're so proud of our longstanding partnership with the Chamber. And before I introduce today's special guest, I'd like to thank you, Jim, and your entire team for helping to lead the business community through the last 16 months. And congratulations on all you've been able to accomplish in this virtual environment. But I will say I'm incredibly excited to see everybody on this phone and Zoom call in person in the very near future. Now, on behalf of Bank of America, it's my honor to formally introduce today's special guest, City of Boston Mayor Kim Janey. Kim Janey is the 55th mayor of Boston. She was sworn in as the first woman and the first Black mayor of the city on March 24th, 2021. Mayor Janey is leading Boston through the COVID-19 pandemic with a citywide agenda for recovery, reopening, and renewal. Mayor Janey's pandemic recovery priorities include distributing vaccines effectively, returning children to school safely, and centering disadvantaged workers and businesses in the city's economic recovery. Mayor Janey is committed to ensuring the city of Boston reopens safely and equitably with relief and renewal in every neighborhood. Prior to becoming mayor in 2021, Janey made history in 2017 when she was elected to the Boston City Council as the first woman to represent District 7. In 2020, she was elected by her peers as president of the Boston City Council. Our city is fortunate to have a leader like Mayor Janey, and we look forward to hearing from her today. Please join me now in welcoming Mayor Kim Janey.
Good morning. Thank you, Mihal, for that introduction, and thank you, Jim Rooney. You were an integral part of my transition committee, and I'm grateful for your leadership. I also want to extend my gratitude to the chair of the board, Michelle Spring. I'm pleased to be joining you today from the Rapid 7 headquarters located in the Hub on Causeway in Boston. Rapid 7 is a leading global technology company led by Corey Thomas. Like Corey, I am committed to investing in Boston's diverse pool of strong and exceptional talent. I appreciate Rapid 7 for hosting me today. It's a beautiful day in Boston. Today, we are healthier than we have been at any time in over a year. New cases of COVID remain at low levels. More than half of our residents are fully vaccinated. Over 60% have received at least one dose. And for those hardest hit by this pandemic, our seniors, over 75% are fully vaccinated. Today, our economy is rebounding and people are getting back to work. Our unemployment rate has dropped from 16% a year ago to roughly 6% today. And economic activity continues to pick up. And today, Boston is buzzing. Tens of thousands of people were out this weekend. Families and friends reconnecting across our city, from Juneteenth celebrations at Franklin Park to barbecues in backyards. Residents and visitors are strolling in our neighborhoods, cooling off in our parks, and dining under our streetlights and stars. It is truly a beautiful day in Boston. As we reflect on our recovery and reopening, we must neither forget the 1,389 souls that we have lost in Boston due to COVID-19, nor the distance we still have to go as a city. Boston, our neighborhoods, our business community, our people, is incredibly strong and resilient. And the challenges we faced prior to COVID are still ones we must solve today. Rising sea levels, high housing costs, and wealth and health and wage disparities along race and gender lines. Our work over the last 16 months provides a path we can follow to tackle these challenges together. We are recovering from this pandemic because we analyzed the data and followed the science. We made tough decisions both at home and at work. And above it all, we partnered together, focusing our efforts on those most in need. Black suffragist Mary Church Terrell coined the phrase, "lifting as we climb." She understood that our own progress is tied to improving the conditions of others. When I took the oath of office, I promised to lift up people most affected by COVID-19 and improve the health, wellness, and economic status of workers and our business community. That promise guided the municipal budget that I submitted to the Boston City Council for approval next week. I want to thank Justin Sterrett, our CFO, and his team for their work. My budget includes $3.2 billion capital plan. It is the largest in our city's history. I believe that now is the time to invest in Boston. It will shape our recovery. To prepare the workforce for our future, we are funding new and renovated public schools across our city, like the Josiah Quincy Upper School in Chinatown that we broke ground on last week. To strengthen open space that residents relied on this past year, we are investing nearly 80 different projects in our parks. And to mend the torn fabric of neighborhoods together after this year of social distancing, we are funding hundreds of millions of dollars for our cherished community centers and libraries. And to make transit and transportation more safe, reliable, and accessible for all, we are dedicating over $1 billion to improving our streets and sidewalks all across our city. As we invest through this budget, We are creating the structures that allow us to not only just get back on our feet, but to go better as a city. In this budget, we are funding Boston's first Office of Participatory Budgeting to elevate the voice that residents have in City Hall. We are creating an Office of Police Accountability and Transparency. This office will strengthen and build trust between the public and our police department. And we are investing heavily in the staff and programs necessary to address the disparities that exist in how city government contracts. The city's recent disparity study examined the $2.1 billion in city government contracts between 2014 and 2019. The study revealed that only 2.5% of the spending went to minority and women-owned businesses combined, and less than 1% went to Black-owned businesses. In a city that has a population that is majority people of color, and in a city that is brimming with talented entrepreneurs of every race, ethnicity, and gender, we can do better. We must do better. Through the work of our Chief of Equity and Inclusion, Selena Barrios-Milner, we are transforming our procurement process to foster systemic change. We are marketing all of our procurement opportunities to diverse vendors, developing yearly equitable spending plans at the department level, and supporting the growth of minority and women-owned businesses. We are also developing a pipeline of diverse vendors. This week, we awarded grants to 56 local diverse businesses through our newly created Boston Contracting Opportunity Fund. This fund helps businesses build their capacity to compete for city contracts. One of the grantees is Ricardo Pierre Lewis of Roxbury. Ricardo ran a valet parking service that was devastated by the pandemic when restaurants shut down. With relief funds from the city, he will be able to support his employees and pivot his operations to managing garages. His business, Privé Parking, was recently awarded a major private contract on the South Boston waterfront, and he will leverage the Opportunity Fund grant to scale up. To further help all companies compete for city contracts, I've created a new 5-person supplier diversity team. This team is charged with creating fair and equitable access to city contracting opportunities. The team is led by a supplier diversity manager, and I also created a new director of strategic procurement in our Office of Administration and Finance. Together, the director of strategic procurement and supplier diversity team will develop the city's first ever purchasing plan. This will help companies see what we plan to purchase so that businesses can get ready to bid. I want to make it easier for businesses to connect with us, so we are hosting Pathways to City Contracting Opportunity Fairs, where entrepreneurs meet with city departments and learn about upcoming contract opportunities that align with their expertise. Quite like the Chamber's Pacesetters program, the city is proactively inviting underrepresented enterprises to do business with us. This is an intentional focus on addressing racial disparities as we advance the city's largest capital budget. It will, over time, increase competition for city contracts, strengthen local businesses, and close persistent wealth gaps in our city. We need to take that same approach in our support for workers and in housing policy. We must be intentional in our efforts as we emerge from this crisis so that we rebound as a stronger city. That means we must continue our focus on those most impacted during this crisis. For many of our lowest income workers, that means simply being able to pay the rent. We have responded with a $50 million rental relief fund. This fund helps renters remain in their homes, it helps landlords keep up their buildings, and it helps our neighborhoods have stability as we emerge from this crisis. This fund is already making a real difference for residents like Marlinda, an elderly woman from Alston. She was about to be evicted from an apartment that she lived in for 27 years. She owed $15,000 in back rent. We were able to pay her landlord all that was due. With our help, Marlinda was able to stay in her home. Suzanne, a landlord from Dorchester who did not want to evict her tenant when he fell ill during the pandemic, had applied for rental relief on his behalf. Through this fund, We paid his back rent, his utilities, and 2 months of future rent. Rental relief is helping our residents get through the crisis, but systemic change is needed to make Boston affordable for the long term. I strongly support the growth of housing in Boston, but it must be growth that helps to build a strong middle class and keep our city accessible to all. In July, we will take it a step in that direction. Under the leadership of Sheila Dillon, our Chief of Housing, we will release a funding RFP of $30 million to support the creation of housing for families, seniors, and currently homeless residents. Home ownership is also a key strategy for tackling the wealth gap in Boston. To make home ownership more accessible, I recently invested $2.4 million in the Boston Home Center's First-Time Home Buyers program. This commitment more than triples the average amount of assistance previously offered by the city to income-eligible first-time home buyers. Emergency relief for renters and home ownership opportunities for residents gives our city and our economy stability, as does support for our small businesses and our city's entrepreneurs. The spirit of entrepreneurship resides deeply in my blood. I come from a long line of entrepreneurs, from construction to graphic design, from insurance to small business incubators. I am proud to come from an enterprising family that means business. Our business community experienced multiple closures and loss of profits during the pandemic. Through grant-making initiatives, such as the Small Business Relief Fund, we distributed $16 million to over 4,000 businesses, from iFresh Noodle in Alston to Beacon Hill Nutrition in the Back Bay to Mattapan Bottle and Can Incorporated to the Rossi Square Theater. To ensure that small businesses can thrive as our city reopens, we've recently taken steps to expand our commercial rent relief and small business support programs by another $16 million. This investment also helps business owners, their landlords, and property managers build long-standing partnerships with each other and with the neighborhoods they serve. Our travel and hospitality sector, which is 70% people of color and the third largest industry in Boston, plummeted during the pandemic. This sector is still climbing towards recovery. So we launched and extended the All-Inclusive Boston campaign. This campaign encourages residents and travelers to take advantage of the unique offerings in each of Boston's neighborhoods. We also launched the Be Local app to support small businesses by rewarding users for shopping locally. Just last week, Midori Morikawa, our Chief of Economic Development, and I hosted a listening session with a critical part of our hospitality sector, our restaurant owners. I heard the challenges they are facing: severe staffing hurdles, limited operating hours, and massive debt from PPP loans. We also heard how valuable the outdoor dining program has been during this pandemic. It has been a lifeline for many of our restaurants. Coming out of the listening session, we are putting in place $1.7 million in new city support for our restaurants. This includes a new outdoor dining team to work with restaurateurs and neighborhoods to bring dining to the streets, sidewalks, and open spaces in the years ahead. It will also fund a marketing campaign for local businesses and restaurants in Boston to raise their profile as we recover as a city. To address the staffing challenges that restaurant owners identified, this funding will also support staff recruitment and retention bonuses and offer tuition assistance to workers for 2 years while employed at a restaurant. This should help our local restaurants and their employees rise as we recover. No matter the scale of your business, you know that your employees are your most critical asset. That's why I'm putting workers at the center of Boston's recovery. I am committed to making sure investments in Boston's reopening not only help businesses, but also help workers whose employment and savings were most impacted by COVID. That's why in our FY22 budget, we are allocating $1 million in job training in the hardest hit industries and $1 million in job training for artists. It's why this budget also expands programs to support childcare entrepreneurs, immigrant professionals, and careers in green jobs and transportation. And it's a budget that invests $4 million to expand our city-sponsored youth summer jobs program to reach 5,000 youth during the summer and 1,000 youth year-round. To help ensure that these investments and our city policies and City Hall best support workers, I'm proud to announce the creation of a new cabinet-level Chief of Labor and Workforce Development. This new cabinet member will help identify and advocate for legislation and investments that will end wage disparities and create stronger career pathways. And they will work across the city to ensure Boston's workers have the skills they need to meet the challenges and opportunities of tomorrow. By focusing on our workers, by supporting our businesses, by diversifying who we contract with, we will all rise from this pandemic to a stronger Boston that is more equitable, just, and resilient. So I encourage you in the days ahead to invest in our talented, local, and diverse businesses who are eager to do business with you. As you return to your offices, hire Boston residents and make Boston youth part of your reopening plans. They need opportunities to grow their skills in a professional workplace. Dine in our neighborhood restaurants. As you make plans for a joyful summer, choose a destination in a neighborhood you've never been to before. We are going better, we are centering equity, and we are lifting as we climb.
Well, thank you for those remarks, Mayor Janey, and for highlighting all the ways that under your leadership, the city has stepped up to help the residents of Boston navigate their way through a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a racial reckoning over the last 15 or 16 months. And thank you for articulating your vision as to how Boston can build back better and how to create a city that is more inclusive and equitable for all. And a final thank you for choosing Rapid 7 for your video, a prominent chamber member that in many ways is a symbol of the new innovation and tech economy of Boston, and with a leader who is a symbol of the new leadership of Boston, Corey Thomas, who happens to be the vice chair of our board as well. So thank you for all of that. I wanted to begin the Q&A by following up on the way you began, expressing joy about all the activity that's starting to emerge around Boston as we come out of the COVID. You mentioned vaccination rates, and maybe probe a little bit more on the numbers in terms of, how much of the population is being vaccinated. Are you just seeing disparities across the neighborhoods of Boston in the vaccination rate?
Well, Jim, let me start by thanking you. I want to thank you, the entire chamber, certainly your board. I also want to thank Corey and the whole entire Rapid 7 team. It was amazing to spend time with them. When it comes to vaccinations in Boston, there is a lot of good news to share. First and foremost, we were able to reopen the city because our positivity levels in terms of infections remain at historic lows. They are the lowest that they have been since we started to track this data a year ago. And across all neighborhoods, we are seeing low levels. All but two, and I'm talking about infections, not vaccines, all but two neighborhoods have seen numbers go down. And now with the vaccines, this was a big priority for me. My first week in office, wanted to ensure that we were doing everything to roll out the vaccine, to make sure that there was equitable distribution. I launched a $1.5 million vaccine equity grant. I added an additional $1.5 million to that when we reopened the city a month ago. This has been really important. We've seen all but 2 of the neighborhoods reach levels of 50% or higher. We have, 64% of all residents in Boston having at least 1 shot, 56.4% fully vaccinated. And across each neighborhood, we are seeing great levels with the exception of 2 that haven't reached the 50% mark. And then we are using the vaccine equity grant as a way to reach those neighborhoods and make sure that we're focusing on those neighborhoods. This is critically important because we know that this is related to the infections. When we see lower numbers of vaccines, we see higher numbers of infections. And so we want to make sure that we are dealing with this across all ages and across all races. 55 years and above, we have about 75% vaccinated. So that is good news. We have more work to do with the younger population, and we certainly have more work to do around race, which is why these grants have been important to make sure that we are working with community partners who have trusted relationships, who are meeting people where they are and getting the vaccine in people's arms.
Hey, you mentioned meeting people where they are, and I know that we've watched you make vaccines accessible and available across the city in so many ways. And I know you're talking to medical professionals and people on the front line. What are you hearing about sort of the challenges? It doesn't seem to be as much of an access issue, which might have been in place before. Is there still some level of vaccine hesitancy or even indifference in some people? What are you hearing?
Yeah, so we are definitely working with a number of partners. Certainly, we have the best hospitals in the country right here in the city of Boston. We have a number of community health centers who have been doing incredible work. There were some challenges in the beginning around access, around supply. We've worked through those, working closely with the state, working with our medical partners. At this point, I think there are still some residents who have hesitancy. And the best way to address that is making sure that we, again, are meeting people where they are, providing information from trusted sources so that people can make informed decisions. With some of the younger people in our city, it is not that long ago that they became eligible for the vaccine. So there's still more work to do. There's also the sense of being invincible, being young, being healthy. This isn't, necessarily something that they see as impacting them in the same way. Earlier this spring, though, when we were seeing spikes, it was among younger people. And so I think that has helped to get more of our younger residents vaccinated when they see that this too can impact them. Fortunately, they do tend to be healthier and to be able to rebound more quickly. My goal is to make sure that everyone who wants the vaccine has the vaccine. And our public health strategy obviously is very much connected to the economic recovery. So the best way to protect ourselves, our families, our communities, the best way to be able to enjoy all of the things that we want to enjoy is by getting vaccinated. And so if there's anyone on this call who needs a vaccine, certainly you can reach out to my office and we can make sure that that happens.
Right. So let's talk about return to the workplace. We're certainly starting to see more activity in different sections of Boston and throughout the Commonwealth. And the business community is looking at sort of the way of bringing people back to the workplace and defining their new normal, applying some of the lessons learned during COVID. A recent survey that we conducted with our colleagues at the Mass Competitive Partnership say that 82% of the businesses will offer some hybrid or remote work, some flexibility. But I always like to remind people, and I read a University of Chicago report that says that 63% of workers cannot work from home. They have to go someplace to do their job. In addition to being a mayor, you have a big management job. You have 18,000 employees. Reflect on both the way that the first responders and the people in the city responded during COVID, looking back and looking forward. How will your workforce what will their new normal be? Many people have to go to work, but some may be able to have some flexibility. And on top of the workforce, talk to the residents about things you might have learned in terms of ways of doing business with the city. Are there things that you'd like to keep that you might have introduced during COVID?
Well, I will start by giving lots of praise to the incredible city workers who have been on the front lines throughout the pandemic. We certainly know that police and firefighters and EMS have been out on the front lines, and we applaud their effort. They have been working in person throughout the pandemic, but so have other city employees. Certainly a number of our public works and folks who take care of our parks and make sure that our streets are kept up and cleaned and are shoveled. But everyone here at City Hall and beyond, whether you work at City Hall or not, has done incredible work. And certainly I want to lift up and elevate our teachers in that conversation. You know, this spring we opened our school buildings and our teachers, you know, worked hard during the pandemic in terms of remote learning, but also in terms of they were essential in terms of making sure that we could reopen our schools. There are definitely, I think, you know, there will be a new normal. And for me, I've been very clear that I don't want to go back to the way things were before, because we know that the way things were before was very inequitable. And this is our opportunity to make sure that we're creating a stronger Boston. And as a city, as city government, we want to be responsive to meeting the needs of the residents in our city. That means we do recognize that there are a number of things throughout COVID where we had to adjust. Supporting our restaurants with outdoor dining is one thing that we obviously want to keep. That is something that came with COVID. We want to keep that. We were able to move more quickly when it comes to permitting. I think we obviously want to, you know, do a better job at permitting, make sure it's more streamlined, and that we certainly do our due diligence in terms of inspections and making sure that we are meeting different standards, but we want to move more quickly. When it comes to remote work or flexible schedules, those are things that we're also exploring. As you point out, not everyone works in an office with a computer screen, but those who do, we want to figure out ways that we can be more flexible. I'm sure that in the private industry, these are the same conversations that many employers are happening with their employees. And those are the conversations that are happening here at City Hall. I will point out that a number of our workforce belong to labor unions. And so some of this also has to be negotiated with our labor unions, unlike many in the private industry. So, there are good things that I think we want to hold on to. Certainly we want to, get rid of all of the bad things, including the pre-existing inequities. And that is the work that we stay laser-like focused on to make sure that we come out of this pandemic stronger, that we're not going back, but that we're going better.
Right. Sticking with the management role of the mayor, the city budget you proposed is $3.75 billion. And you said in your remarks that you've also proposed a $3.2 billion, I think, capital spending plan. Some big numbers. I don't want to dive too much into sort of where that's going, but I do want to talk about process, because you mentioned the creation of an Office of Participatory Budgeting for the first time in the city. And the city council passed a change to the charter that would put a question on the ballot, giving the council more power during the budget process. In Boston, we're used to the strong mayor process. So how do you see these changes, both what you've introduced administratively and what the council has put on the ballot? How do you see that changing the process in future years? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I would say right now there is a process in place currently where the council obviously has a number of hearings, budget hearings for the city's budget, and residents have a role to play and are able to participate in that. Is that enough? We have learned through the CPA, the Community Preservation Act, that there is a lot of engagement and that residents have a lot to say about how and where we spend our money. And so creating the Office of Participatory Budgeting gives more voice to residents. I'm not sure what will happen with the ballot question, which is why I thought it would be important to create this office regardless, to give more voice to residents. One thing that I am very proud of, and I think we should all be very proud of, is the fact of our AAA bond rating when it comes to the finances in the city, and we certainly want to maintain that. I don't believe the two are mutually exclusive. I think we can have much more engagement in our budget process in terms of how we are investing our city resources, our spending, and have a good credit rating when it comes to our standing. In terms of how we spend our money, I think we can do a much better job. You also heard in my remarks the need to focus on equity and inclusion. Everyone knows by now the $2.1 billion that was spent between 2014 and 2019, and how less than 1% went to Latino-owned businesses or Black-owned businesses, and very little went to women-owned businesses. We have an opportunity through the FY22 budget to do better. We have an opportunity just through better management of how we spend to make sure that more of that money is getting to businesses owned by people of color and owned by women. And I would suggest that we all have that responsibility. And I know you care deeply about that, and you have the Pacesetters program, but everyone in private industry should also be heeding the call and making sure that they are doing business with locally owned businesses, with people of color, and with women.
Thank you. We're starting to get some good questions in the Q&A feature, and I want to start with the subject of education, beginning with an acknowledgement of your deep experience throughout your professional career in the field of education, and seek your insights into the Boston public school system and the challenges now of helping all of our children recover from the experience that they had. Let's start with Commissioner Riley. Commissioner Riley yesterday said he's concerned about the turnover in the Boston School Committee and might consider freezing some federal funding coming to BPS. I think the amount is about over $400 million. Your thoughts on Commissioner Riley's concerns? Let's start with that.
Well, I think if the concern is instability, one, freezing resources would create instability, would not solve that issue. Two, I think our school department is in a good position to move forward. There are vacancies on the Boston School Committee, certainly, that need to be filled, and I am making sure that we are filling those voids. The application process opened up last Thursday. We are taking applications. Anyone who is a Boston resident and has a passion for education, a passion for our young people, are welcome to apply. I think it is very important that we make sure that we are filling the void in terms of Latina leadership, with two members who have recently stepped down, and that we stay focused on the work of eliminating opportunity gaps in BPS, making sure that every child has access to a great school, that every child has the opportunity to learn. That is the focus. And that is what we have to stay focused on. And that is how we would use the federal resources. I know you are part of Dr. Caselius's team of stakeholders. I'm certainly grateful for your participation and leadership in that. You have been great on my transition team as a co-chair, and so I'm grateful again for your leadership there. But freezing resources is not the way to move forward here. What we know, particularly coming out of COVID, particularly as we are preparing to reopen our school buildings this fall and bring all of our students back, we need to invest in our schools. We need to invest in our education system, and we need all hands on deck. And so I would encourage Secretary Riley, I would encourage everyone to open up their arms and wrap them around our young people and make sure that we are making good investments in our schools.
Well, thank you for those kind words, and I've enjoyed my opportunities to both serve on the transition team and currently with Superintendent Caselius and interact with a wide variety of stakeholders, so thank you. I want to stay with education, but shift to Madison Park Technical Vocational High School. A lot of interest in the business community and the success of that high school. The Chamber released a report several years ago that with several recommendations to better leverage that school as a talent pipeline. You represented that school's neighborhood in District 7, and now you oversee the school system. Your thoughts on Madison Park? What can the city do better to assist the school in preparing the region's future workforce for especially in-demand careers of the 21st century?
So Madison is definitely near and dear to my heart. You know, I come from a family of educators and I care deeply. Obviously, I spent a good chunk of my career advocating for opportunities for our young people. And Madison is well positioned under the leadership of Kevin McCaskill, the executive director. I think you're aware that there's also a search underway for a headmaster to join that team. And there are so many opportunities. Just a couple of weeks ago, I did a tour and had a chance to speak with students and some of their teachers at Madison, from the cosmetology program to the culinary arts program there, to many of the programs that are focused on the building trades. There are a lot of good things happening at Madison. Certainly there have been some stumbling blocks along the way in terms of turnover with leadership but those things, I think, are with Kevin in place, have been stabilizing. In fact, young people have been thriving. There have been some changes too in terms of how students are assigned. So one issue years ago was that, you know, Madison was being used as a catch-all for students who may not have gotten their first assignment in BPS. And now there is a policy in which students who want to be at Madison, who choose Madison, are actually at Madison. Now, Madison also wants to put in place an admissions policy. And so we need to look at that as well. What we don't want to do, though, is create barriers to entry. We want to make sure that the students who are there want to be there, that they understand, that they have great opportunity in terms of a vocation. And then we have to invest more in terms of making sure that there are other opportunities in terms of the 21st century skills that our young people will need beyond the building trades, beyond culinary arts, and beyond cosmetology. But what I saw was incredible, great partnerships with labor unions there at Madison. But we do need to invest, I think, more in terms of what is offered there, and that will require some money, which is all the more reason why we should not be freezing any of the federal resources coming to our schools.
Right. We have a question that's somewhat of a follow-up as it relates to job training. First, gratitude for your leadership and the $1 million commitment to job training. The question is, are you targeting specific focus areas for this training to support growth and alignment of higher paying and in-demand jobs such as IT and technology-related jobs? Any targets
related
for that?
To the schools or?
No, not related to the schools. The job training money, the $1 million.
Yeah, so there is a focus. There's, in addition to the job training money there is a focus on green jobs. We have an opportunity through our response to climate resiliency to ensure, one, that we're protecting our planet, that we're building the right infrastructure. We are a coastal city, and there is a real opportunity to engage our young people, workers, as we rebound from COVID, to be part of that work. And so there is a focus on green jobs. I think we also have an opportunity with the life sciences to, continue the growth of Boston. That can help fuel that growth, that can help create jobs for residents right here. And we have to make sure that there is a good pipeline in terms of training and opportunity, particularly for young people coming out of our schools, to take advantage of those jobs.
We have an interesting question from a small business owner, but a small business owner operating in the digital economy. The question suggests that many of the programs stood up by different levels of government to help people through the crisis are aimed at brick and mortar businesses. And the question is, are resources available for digital companies as well, not just those that are sort of Main Street or brick and mortar?
Yeah. One thing, too, that we saw with the pandemic is that companies, businesses that were more connected, no pun intended, were able to sustain themselves and stay open. And so we did have to provide a lot of support to those who did not have that kind of infrastructure. We are investing. There are investments in this budget to expand the work that we're doing in terms of digital equity, in terms of residents as well as businesses. We need, whether brick and mortar or not, we need to make sure that the infrastructure is in place and that we are closing the digital divide. We saw that, how important that was during the pandemic, and that will continue, post-pandemic, because we know that the workplace is changing and the way people get information, the way that they get goods and services is changing. And so we have to make sure that we are able to adapt and that we're able to meet those needs.
Mayor, this would not be a chamber forum if we didn't talk about transportation a little bit. So let's get at that. We actually have a question from a T Red Line rider. So let's start with the T. And I want to begin with the T Control Board. Their last meeting of the current control board was just this Monday. There's proposals in both the House and the Senate to create a new board. Former Mayor Walsh had advocated for a Boston seat on that board, but it doesn't appear that either of the proposals in the House and Senate do that. They do have a municipal designee, but not necessarily from Boston. Your thoughts on, the degree to which Boston should have a seat on that board?
Well, I agree. Boston should have a seat on that board. I've been a strong advocate in having a seat for Boston on that board. So much of the T's infrastructure is right here in Boston. I have been working closely with Steve to make sure that we are aligned in terms of the infrastructure that I am investing in terms of our budget, the FY22 budget, so that we can have a better transit. You're speaking my language when you talk about transit. So I do not own a car. I still use public transportation, even though it looks different for me because I've got a detail that follows me around. But we get on the T, and it's important. I actually enjoy riding the T. When I travel to other cities, it's something that I want to experience. I want to see how their T system, their public transit system works compared to ours. I want to understand what it means for our residents right here in Boston. This is very important. It is a way that many folks get into work, certainly pre-pandemic. It is something that we know has equity implications in terms of the number of riders who spend more time. So 64% Black spend more time on public transit than white, and that takes them away from families, from jobs, from appointments. And so we have work to do in terms of building an infrastructure that allows for more accessible, more reliable more affordable public transit. It isn't something, obviously, that the city of Boston controls. We all know that. This is a state issue. But there is work that we can do. And I am making the investments as mayor to make sure that our streets work well for different modes of transportation. Certainly, dedicated bus lanes for buses, but we also need to make sure that we have bike lanes so that we can have more people traveling by bike and not in cars. The more people in cars, the more traffic and congestion we'll have. It's a simple math problem. So we have to make sure that our streets work for everyone, including pedestrians like myself and like many others who enjoy a good walk and who need to get through our city and make sure that our sidewalks and our streets are safe and accessible. I'm also investing money into a pilot for a free bus that would go down a major economic corridor in Boston, connecting Mattapan Square to Grove Hall to Nubian Square. We know that this is a huge equity issue. It's an environmental justice issue. If we can get more people out of their cars and onto the bus. And it's also a racial justice issue. So I hope that we will be able to do more of that through creative investment and partnerships.
So, Mayor, sticking on mobility and transportation, I think some people that are returning to their workplaces in Boston who may not have been in different sections of the city will notice that the city has done quite a bit of work during COVID on bike lanes, on bus lanes, and some of it not as dramatic as in other cities. I saw a report over the weekend where in Paris they're planning to permanently shut some streets down. And I'm sure there's other American cities that are doing the same. But your thoughts on the use of streets for mobility purposes, and a question in the Q&A relates specifically to scooters. Scooters are not allowed in Boston right now. I know that they were under consideration under Mayor Walsh, and they're in some other cities. But your thoughts on the sharing of streets for these other mobility purposes, and specifically a question about scooters.
So certainly we'll consider scooters. Definitely a big fan of sharing our roads, our streets. We have to do so in a way that ensures the safety of all who use our streets, which is why the infrastructure is so important. There are definitely other cities that use scooters and other modes of transportation, as well as a lot of walkable streets. Before the pandemic, it's probably the last trip I took. There was a learning journey in Oslo, Norway, and their entire downtown center is car-free. And it is wonderful. Like, I know that is a hard concept for us to consider in Boston and in other urban areas where people are very dependent on their cars. But it really opened up commerce in a different way. You see, of course, the outdoor dining. You just see pedestrians taking advantage and getting through. There are bikes and there were scooters, there were other things. I think we have to continue to build the infrastructure here in Boston. We obviously have to continue to engage with our residents in the city as we do this work. And we have to be open to considering other modes of transportation. Again, the more cars that we have, the more traffic and congestion. And so we want to make sure that people can get around our city freely using different modes of transportation and that they are safe.
Great. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to try to squeeze in a few more questions that we received. One is interesting in terms of the need for the mayor of Boston to work with other leaders of municipalities, with the state, with the federal delegation. Can you share some things that you're working on or that you have in mind to work with the regional leaders, state leaders, federal leaders on?
Wonderful. Very, very important. And as mayor of Boston, have already had the opportunity to work with our federal partners, our state partners, as well as other municipalities all across the Commonwealth, with a focus on those who are in the greater Boston area. As mayor, I participate in the Metro Mayors meetings that happen regularly. I also work with the state delegation. Obviously I have legislation up there. I was proud to host the Boston delegation at the State House, at the Parkman House last month. Obviously working with the Boston City Council here. So partnership is very important. There are lots of things that we have to have a regional approach on, including housing, making sure that we are dealing with the housing crisis. There is an affordability crisis. And so working with other mayors and other municipalities to ensure that there is a regional approach there. We just talked about public transit. Obviously, that impacts other municipalities as well. There are crises like the opioid epidemic here that plays out largely in Boston, but we know that addiction knows no boundaries and that many of the residents that we are serving here in Boston originated from other towns. And so there's work underway with other mayors to make sure that there's a regional approach there. There are lots of opportunities to work collaboratively across the board and to make sure that we are being strategic in terms of the investments that are needed and our advocacy to our federal partners and to the White House to do this work together.
Right. I'm going to close with a question about the summer. The job of mayor brings with it seasonal challenges here in Boston, certainly winter challenges, but summer's upon us. So talk about managing through the summer, what's on your mind, and the specific question is, how do you see public outdoor space and recreation space contributing to city life, but managing through the summer more broadly?
So one thing that I will say, and it's not so much summer, but is definitely hot weather related. One thing that we found over the spring was a number of 90-degree days, unlike previous years, and it is getting hotter and hotter. So one thing we will have to do moving forward is opening up our cooling stations earlier and making sure that in our parks, the sprinklers are working earlier. The date was set for June. That's too late. We need to do that earlier in May, probably Memorial Day weekend. We also need to have a policy in our schools for extremely hot days. Just like we have snow days, I've asked our superintendent to look at a policy around extreme heat because we know that impacts students' ability to learn. All of that being said, our summers do provide wonderful opportunity for residents to reconnect and rebuild. I think this is especially important after a year plus of devastation and isolation from COVID-19. And so that is why I have called for a joy agenda that seeks to be very intentional about creating space and opportunity, engaging residents and community groups and nonprofits around joy, giving out grants to groups so that they can create joy and define what that means for them, making sure that we're engaging artists in our joy agenda. We saw a lot of this play out over the past weekend with celebrations around Juneteenth, and we need to do more of that. This will help us rebuild, reconnect, and reimagine what it means to live and have a great city like the city of Boston.
Well, thank you, Mayor Janey, for spending time with us today. Our business community is thankful for your leadership and your hard work during this recovery. And for all our viewers, this is a reminder that our Government Affairs Forum series takes a break over the summer. So I hope, as Mayor Janey suggests, all our viewers will experience some joy over the coming months. But stay engaged with the Chamber. Our work doesn't end as our events take a break. But coming out of the summer, on September 30th, we'll feature Suffolk County District Attorney Rachel Rollins in our Back to the Work, Back to Fall agenda for our Government Affairs Forum. So I hope you'll join us in that program. And as always, you can register for Government Affairs Forum events and other programs by visiting bostonchamber.com. Once again, thank you, Mayor Janey. Thank you all for joining us. Enjoy the rest of the day and enjoy the summer.